Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having us.
We're especially glad to be here because we were scheduled to be on a panel together that was canceled due to the pandemic. So thanks for making it happen. We're here to talk about fighting the surveillance state. Jen, who are you?
So I'm Jen Lee, and I lead the tech and liberty policy work at the American Civil Liberties Union of Washington, or for short, the ACLU of Washington. For those who don't know the ACLU, we are a nonprofit and a public interest law firm in the US, and we work in the courts, in legislatures, and with communities to defend and preserve the individual rights and liberties guaranteed to everyone in the US by our Constitution and our laws. We work on a lot of different issue areas, including healthcare, immigration, policing, criminal justice, youth policy, and technology. And our overall objective in doing our tech and liberty work is to protect people's rights in the face of new and powerful technologies, and to make technology accountable to people, and particularly the people and communities that have always been disproportionately affected by surveillance. We do this work in a few key ways. First, we advocate for community-centric policies and laws that create safeguards around data and technologies. And sometimes we may advocate to stop use of certain technologies altogether if appropriate. Where existing laws are unjust or have been violated, we conduct strategic litigation with our legal team to remedy harms. And lastly, and very importantly, we convene the Tech Equity Coalition to organize with communities and individuals. And we work together to hold tech accountable and lift up the voices of oppressed communities. Key things we've been working on include passing laws on facial recognition, data privacy, and AI-based automated decision-making systems. On a more personal note, I want to share that I started off learning about tech policy from a healthcare angle, and I quickly realized that tech and the need for tech accountability affects almost every arena of our lives. So when I got this job at the ACLU, I moved from New York, where I'm from, to Seattle, where I live now. And I've been really blessed to meet some incredible advocates organizing around issues pertaining to lots of things like immigration, policing, and gender justice, just to name a few. And everyone's voice in the tech ethics and accountability conversation have been absolutely critical. And I just want to share that anyone who has interest in fighting for tech equity has the power to get involved in this important conversation. And I'll pass it to Eleni. What is the, can we get an introduction of you?
Yeah, I'm so glad to be here. Hi, I'm Eleni Manis, rhymes with Jenny, Eleni. I'm the research director at STOP. STOP is the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. We're a New York City-based nonprofit. I am in New York City. There's a small New York City apartment behind my screen. We work to end mass surveillance at the local level. So we work in New York City and New York State, but we're aiming to provide a model for other cities and other states. In my role, I work with our legal fellows and research interns. Let me just put in a plug. If you would like to work with me, where's the chat? We're hiring for the next group and cohorts of legal fellows and research interns. But with the research interns and with the legal fellows, we produce white papers, we put on conferences. So recently we put out a paper on neighborhood surveillance apps like Nextdoor, like Neighbors, where people post their Ring footage. We put up a paper on privacy concerns around ultra wideband beacons like AirTags or Amazon Tiles, which you can use to track your book bag or an intimate partner, unfortunately. We've documented NYPD's abuse of surveillance tech like facial recognition. We recently documented its failure to comply with the Post Act, which requires NYPD to publicly report its surveillance technology. So that gives you an idea of what STOP's research team works on. Since you don't know me on a personal level, so I live in New York City. I had a son just before the pandemic got started, so I'm a big fan of Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood and Playgrounds After Dark. If you're a caregiver and or tired, I stand in tired solidarity with you. And the last thing I'll add, since I imagine some of you may be academics, is that I am a post-academic philosophy professor. So I started my career focused on democratic justice. And I still do ethics related work in my current job, and I still work with students. But I now work at an organization that does more practical work that makes a significant change for good in the real world. So if that's a place that you're at, if you're stuck in academia, especially if you're stuck in the humanities, I'm very happy to chat. So that's me. Shall we get started and talk about what we're worried about? Let's talk about some of the worst instances of government surveillance.
Sure, I can go ahead and start. So we know that surveillance of oppressed communities is not a new phenomenon in any sense of the word. History has shown us that surveillance technologies serve as tools for those in power to control and monitor people who are most vulnerable, whether or not the technology was actually designed for that purpose. But the institutions that continue to oppress and brutalize the lives of Black, Indigenous, and other oppressed communities are now equipped with tools truly unprecedented in their surveillance power, like face recognition, location tracking, drones, and other AI-based tools. A key difference between these new powerful technologies and technologies of the past is that these new technologies are powered by unprecedented amounts of data. And these new tools have powerful surveillance capabilities that can even make important decisions about people's lives. I'm worried about increasingly powerful, invisible, and unaccountable technologies continuing to be built and deployed without adequate consideration of the impacts on communities. And I'm worried that this will continue to exacerbate the structural racism and inequities already present in our societies. I worry that we don't have sufficient laws to regulate collection, use, and sale of our personal information that often feeds these technologies. I worry that we don't have adequate, if any, transparency and accountability over if and how these technologies are being used. I worry that communities who are most oppressed often don't have a meaningful say in whether or not these technologies are deployed. And I worry that a surveillance infrastructure is being steadily built not only by governmental entities, but also by corporate entities, and often with a biased assumption that technology will make people's lives better. And I worry about that assumption because we have to think about for whom will a technology be beneficial or harmful. And the reality is that tech is often built without the perspectives of those it harms. So that's a lot of stuff I'm worried about. I'm sure that Eleni also worries about these things, but I will pass it on to Eleni to share what she worries about.
I think you've covered the terrain. I just want to emphasize the thing that worries me most, more than any particular technology, is just how little public oversight and public knowledge there is of surveillance technologies as they're used by government agencies. So I worry about, and I think you all should worry about, how little public oversight and consequently how little public control there is over most local police precincts' use of surveillance tech, like predictive policing tools or facial recognition. STOP and its coalition partners pushed for the passage successfully of the POST Act, which requires NYPD to report its surveillance tools. It's bare bones legislation. It's just a beginning. But NYPD's first annual disclosures, in accordance with the law, failed to meet even the minimal bar around disclosure required by the POST Act. So we need more public accountability around tech. Because what we do know suggests that secrecy is not good for responsible use of tech. So for example, some accidentally shared documents show that NYPD edits photos before feeding them to facial recognition. And it's also quite open to using low quality matches as the basis for investigations, the partial basis for investigations. So all of Jen's worries with an underlining under the lack of public knowledge and of surveillance tech.
So Eleni, can you share which communities do you think are most affected by this kind of surveillance?
Yeah, sure. And let's talk a little bit about why we're talking about the communities that are affected by surveillance. We could talk about privacy concerns in the abstract. Without privacy, our democracy, our democratic processes are affected, right? Freedom of speech is affected. But STOP worries most about harms due to surveillance when police use tech to continue the over-policing of the same old communities that they've harassed without tech. People of color, undocumented immigrants, Muslims, LGBTQ people, protesters. It's just that now, with the help of technology, these communities can be more effectively harassed. So whereas police once had to actually show up at a protest to see who attended, they can now issue a geofence warrant and figure out whose cell phones were in Washington Square Park last Friday night. So the communities that are most affected are the ones that have been targeted in the past by police and continue to be targeted with surveillance tech.
That's a great point. And I also agree with Lenny that it's the same communities that continue to be over surveilled and over policed. And we see that, with examples, past and more recent examples, but going back to the 1930s and 40s, we know that the US government subcontracted with IBM during that time, which provided its Holler's punch card machines to surveil and target Japanese Americans via census data. And then moving forward into the 1950s, the FBI launched a domestic intelligence program called COINTELPRO, which many of you know of, that quickly evolved into an effort to suppress domestic political dissidents through an array of illegal activities. We have the Patriot Act, which was passed weeks after 9/11, and other surveillance programs launched shortly thereafter have enabled so many surveillance abuses and have resulted in direct harms to Arab and Muslim communities. And now we see immigration and customs enforcement using technologies like ALPRs or automated license plate reader technology, self-snooping devices, as well as facial recognition to surveil and target immigrants for deportation. So there are a number of people at risk of at disproportionate risk of harm from the use of surveillance tools, especially in the hands of law enforcement.
Thanks. I'm reading the chat. Do we want to get into questions, or should we, I think let's hold off on questions till the very end.
Sure.
Okay. So let's talk about commercial. Sorry, I'm a little bit off track as I scan through the chat. Thank you so much for your thoughtful comments. I think we'll wait until the end of our spiels, but you've given us an idea of how concerning government surveillance is. Let's talk about commercial surveillance and how it's intertwined with government surveillance.
I think what's really concerning these days is that there seems to be an increasingly blurred line between corporate and government surveillance. So often data that's collected by private entities, commercial entities, are sold to governmental entities. So in 2020, an investigation revealed that the US military was buying the location data of users of Muslim prayer and dating apps like Muslim Pro. That's really concerning because that kind of surveillance may have a chilling effect on freedom of religion, as the Muslim community may be afraid to use Mecca-orienting apps for prayer or to visit mosques out of fear that they will be targeted by the US government, as they have in the past and continue to be. Even if you're not part of the Muslim community, if you have a cell phone, we learned in 2019 that a number of cell providers like AT&T, T-Mobile, and Sprint sold customers' locations and personally identifying information to third-party companies, with the information eventually falling into the hands of bail bond firms and bounty hunters, and potentially government entities as well. I think we need to be really concerned with the lack of regulation around sale of our personal information. That gets even more concerning when we talk about technologies like facial recognition or technologies that capture video or capture our biometrics. When people talk about should we be concerned about the blurring of the line between corporate and government surveillance, the first example I think of is Ring, because Ring, is used by civilians. People just put Ring cameras on their door, but these cameras may pick up really sensitive locations like places of worship, abortion clinics, domestic violence shelters. They can invade on people's private lives and constitutionally protected activities. They may just capture the faces of people walking by, and you may be put in a database, both a public and private surveillance database, just for walking to a friend's door. We know that law enforcement, or I should say, Amazon is giving police departments free or discounted Ring cameras to residents, as well as a portal for requesting video and special access to a application, which helps neighbors share video clips. So there's a lot of uncertainty and lack of clarity around, how data is flowing between governmental entities, law enforcement, as well as private companies like Amazon. There are hundreds of more examples, but I think this is a really salient one that always gets me really worried.
I'm going to add a little bit more about Ring, just because it's affiliated with the Neighbors app, where people can post their Ring footage. Ring, in combination with the Neighbors app, is an unprecedented extension of police surveillance with free civilian labor, right? So places the police couldn't originally have very much surveillance in residential neighborhoods are now completely open to the police. And it's for free because people are posting their footage, with no labor cost on the part of police on the Neighbors app. So I think that we need to be careful. One of the questions that Mia had for us is like, what can people do? You can avoid adding to the surveillance economy. Don't use Ring. Don't put footage on neighbors. Be careful about the data that you produce and make available to police agencies. I also want to add, if we look at apps, even education apps that kids use to do math, like Delta Math, they collect extraordinary amounts of personal data on students, and it's available to police. Most privacy policies of commercial apps say, we'll hand this over if the police come knocking, without a warrant. So there's just incredible overlap between the data that is collected by commercial entities and the data that's available to police. Commercial surveillance is government surveillance these days. Shall we talk about the papers and projects that our organizations are up to or have recently completed?
That sounds like a great idea, and we can segue into things people can do to get involved. Yeah, sure. Do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I'll talk about STOP. So STOP is a fairly new organization. Our first big win with our coalition partners was to get New York City's Post Act passed in 2020. And it is the first NYPD surveillance reform in a generation. And we are pushing to get NYPD to comply with the Post Act before we hopefully pass Post Act 2, requiring even more disclosure from NYPD. What else? This summer, STOP with the Legal Aid Society revealed over $250 million worth of secret NYPD surveillance contracts. They've been hidden under the Special Expenses Program, which thankfully was terminated in response to the Post Act. And we and our partners got the New York State Assembly to pass a law that ends police access to COVID-19 contact tracing data. But the most important thing I should probably add about STOP is that while we're not a very large organization, we tap a very large network to move our agenda forward. So local groups and organizations that don't focus on surveillance as their primary area of focus, but that work on behalf of communities that are impacted by surveillance, but that are over-policed, work with us to help push our agenda forward. So this is a new model for local action. I think that's STOP's modus operandi. Jen, how about your branch of the ACLU?
We're working on a lot of similar topics, but with an eye towards legislation, because that's the bulk of the work I do. Since we were just talking about privacy, and I see some questions in the chat about privacy and personal information, I guess I'll start off by talking about the People's Privacy Act, which is a proactive piece of data privacy legislation that we've introduced in Washington state that would require any covered entities like companies collecting people's information to first get people's permission or opt-in consent before they collect and use that information, use or share, sell that information. We introduced this bill because at present, the US does not have a comprehensive data privacy law, and that's really concerning. It means that we don't have transparency and accountability for data uses, and people have really little control over how their information is collected, used, and shared. This bill that we helped co-create was introduced by Representative Kloba in the 2021 session, and the bill number is HB 1433. it would prohibit, in addition to requiring affirmative opt-in consent for any company to use your data beyond a primary transaction that you've requested, it would really importantly allow individuals to hold companies who violate your privacy rights accountable. The bill also prohibits AI-based profiling and use of facial recognition tools in places of public accommodation like schools, restaurants, grocery stores, and parks. We've been fighting against some bad data privacy bills in Washington state for a few years now. So this was our proactive approach to pushing for strong data privacy protections. Something else we're working on, local face recognition bans. So we now have at least 23 US jurisdictions that have passed bans on government use of facial recognition technology. And King County, Washington recently became one of those jurisdictions. King County is the headquarters of both Microsoft and Amazon, and it's the first multi-city county to ban government use of facial recognition, which is really, really huge. Even more recently, Bellingham, Washington passed not only a ban on government use of facial recognition, but also a ban on government use of predictive policing tools. And most of you are probably aware, but predictive policing tools are algorithmic tools used by law enforcement to try to forecast crime before it happens, which is absurdly concerning. So it's really amazing that Bellingham banned the use of these tools. And this victory came about because People First Bellingham brought forth an initiative, a ballot initiative to ban the use of these technologies. So we're really grateful to our partners in Bellingham. Some other stuff we're working on, we are working on an automated decision system bill called, well, it's just called our automated decision system bill, but the bill number is SB 5116. And this bill would require any government agency using automated decision-making systems like facial recognition or risk assessment tools to make any government entity making decisions about people using these sort of systems to make transparent their use of such tools. The bill would also prohibit government entities from using ADS to discriminate and would empower people to hold government agencies accountable if they discriminate via ADS. This bill, SB 5116, is sponsored by Senator Hasagawa, and we introduced it in the 2021 session, and it passed out of the policy committee, but didn't manage to get out of the legislature. But we did manage to get a budget proviso out of the legislature that creates a work group, an automated decision work group for us to look at ADS and generate recommendations for the legislature and the governor's office. And for the past over 6 months, we've been working on that report for the legislature and the governor's office. And we're really excited about some of the findings and recommendations in there. And hopefully in the upcoming session or future sessions, we'll be able to pass a really strong automated decision system bill. And besides that, we're working with the Tech Equity Coalition, which is comprised of many organizations and individuals working to make technology equitable, to do some lawmaker education, public education, and do advocacy in the political arena.
Thanks. I've been scanning the chat, and there's one question that I most want to address. And the question is, what do you want in the way of public oversight? A few things I want. We want the end of secret use of technology by government agencies, especially the police, right? We want government contracts that allow truly independent third-party audits. We want limits on data collection, on data retention, on data sharing, and ultimately, on the basis of information obtained by audits and other access to these tools, we want to ban the use of surveillance tech that's used to perpetuate racially biased policing. So that's the kind of public oversight we want. And how is it accomplished? Typically through legislation, possibly by lawsuits through the ACLU and STOP. Shall we talk about what people can do to help join the fight against the surveillance state?
Yeah, that sounds like a great, great next topic.
I think it depends on who you are. So if you work for an advocacy organization, secure your devices and your data. And that's something that STOP can provide training on for aligned organizations. If you're a if you're a product designer, don't collect data about people unless you already have a predefined need for that data, and then don't collect more data than you need or retain it for longer than you need to satisfy your goal. If you're a government agency, the same thing goes. Don't collect or retain data about residents indiscriminately, and don't do business with vendors who do that, who collect mounds of data about your residents before they even know whether they need it. Because when that data exists, when personal data about city residents exists, it just attracts the attention of police, who can then pass it on to immigration agencies. For all of us as private citizens, I think we want to say that each one of us has a role to play in resisting the normalization of surveillance tech. So when you go out and buy holiday gifts, don't buy AirTags, don't buy Ring doorbells, don't buy Alexa's, Echo's, connected home devices. They create detailed data about where you're going and what you're doing when you're home. Make a point of deleting apps that collect and share tons of personal detailed data, and use web browser versions instead. This kind of data might not be worrisome for you, but it's dangerous that it's being collected for members of over-policed communities. So we shouldn't help make routine and normal the needless collection of tons and tons of personal data as a requirement of using an app or going online or going shopping. Jen, what do you think people who are watching today should do?
Well, first, I completely agree with you. I think we need to do the best we can to resist against just like the building of the surveillance infrastructure that's happening every single day. It's totally becoming normalized, but it's really difficult, I think, for so much of the responsibility to be on the individual and the consumer. And that's why I think advocating for strong legislation is ultimately what we need at the end. So you can do both. It's not an either or, but I think we do need strong legislation. And so what I would recommend for folks who want to get involved in these sorts of conversations, if you have any, either technical expertise, academic expertise, and very importantly, lived experience with concerning the impacts of technology, that's really important to share with lawmakers who are making these decisions. I would recommend learning about the legislative process in your jurisdiction, either your city council, your county, your state, because I think local politics is really where a lot of these changes happen. And it's different depending on the jurisdiction. So it's really, I think, important to have at least a good, some understanding, and better if you have a good understanding of that legislative process. And when you do get that information, please share that with your friends and your community so they can also get politically involved and active. Talking with lawmakers is really important, because one of the things we learned, and I'm sure you have also learned if you've already engaged in these conversations, is that lawmakers are seeking a lot of this information because a lot of this information is new to lawmakers, and it's often complex. There's so many different angles, and technology is applicable to so many different sectors that it's a lot of information to take in. So the more you can educate your lawmakers, I think the better they will be equipped to pass strong legislation. I would also encourage folks to plug into your local coalitions. I mentioned that in Washington State, we have the Tech Equity Coalition, which is convened by the ACLU. And it started off with mostly organizations not working in the technology space, but organizations who interact with technology because of the nature of their work. So like immigration advocates, are dealing with ALPRs, or the use of automated license plate readers by law enforcement. That has intersections. I would encourage you to plug into local coalitions, or see if you can connect with folks who are working on issues that touch upon tech and start those conversations and build those relationships. I would also recommend, if you have the capacity and, once you're involved in coalitions, you have a good understanding of the legislative process, ballot initiatives are really cool. I shared that the Bellingham victory with the ban on predictive policing tools and face recognition was won via a ballot initiative. That was 100% people power led. So I really recommend, learning more about that process. That would be really awesome. And on a more general note, I've shared this before, but I think that when we're having these sort of conversations with lawmakers, friends, family members, we should really be thinking about some key questions, some of which include who has the power to decide whether and how to deploy a certain technology, what kinds of regulations are different communities calling for, with what lens and for whom are terms like cost and benefit designed, and what would tech and tech policies look like in a world where those who are oppressed in our society wield the most authority in making those decisions. I think those are good questions to kind of frame conversations and thinking around tech accountability and transparency.
I want to second Jen's advice that we be politically involved and join coalitions, but I want to address two quick questions in the remaining minutes in the chat. One is the why should I hang up my Alexa, right? Why should I join the fight? And the other one is the how can I do it on a day-to-day basis? So why should you inconvenience yourself by becoming politically involved and or by ceasing to use surveillance technology on your phone? If you're fortunate not to worry very much about police abuses affecting you directly, please stand against mass surveillance in solidarity with communities that don't have that privilege. So surveillance tools lead to police interactions. ShotSpotter brings police to looking for trouble to low-income and minority communities. Nextdoor and the Ring doorbell app bring police to neighborhoods looking for supposed suspects. So the reason to stop is perhaps not for your own personal convenience, but in solidarity with communities that don't have that privilege. How to do it? With Jen, I would love it if you were politically involved, right? We see a few comments in the chat saying, I don't have the bandwidth for that. At the very least, in your personal life, take a stand against surveillance by deleting apps that collect lots of personal information, by taking small steps to secure your own data and to make that normal. So thanks. Jen, do you have any last words before we run out of time?
Yeah, I just kind of want to second what you ended on, Eleni, because I think that's quite important. I think we all have power within the specific institutions and the context in which we operate. And we need to really focus on changing power structures in those contexts. So whether you're an academic, you're an artist, you're a technologist, an educator, a lawyer, a policy advocate, I think we all have a responsibility to continuously practice sharing institutional and personal power with oppressed communities. And I think that means kind of going back to the questions that I raised, the key questions, thinking about who has the power to decide whether and how to deploy a certain technology, and how is cost and benefit being defined. I also want to note that you've probably engaged in or heard of community engagement processes that are created by lots of entities like corporate entities, governmental entities, nonprofit entities, and educational institutions. But these community engagement processes don't actually function to equip communities with decision-making power, but rather they may function to inadvertently or purposely co-opt community voices and legitimize decisions that have already been made. So, I'm just thinking about task forces or some outreach process that asks community members to draft recommendations or lengthy reports, but then those recommendations and the content of those reports are not actually heeded by decision makers. And it's also important to note that community expertise in these decision-making processes is often undervalued, while academic, technical, and legal voices are elevated as the only, quote unquote, experts and given authority, even when those expert voices don't actually come from impacted communities and might contradict community expertise. So I think it's good to keep that in mind as you go about engaging in this work, because the more we look towards the voices of folks who are most impacted by these technologies, I think the closer we get to tech justice and tech equity. And that's not easy, but I think it's something to keep in mind.
It's true, surveillance tech is everywhere, but it's not inevitable that things will continue in their current Wild West state.